The world's top trade unionist is calling on New Zealand to protect migrant workers as if they were our own. Sharan Burrow is the General Secretary of the International Trade Union Confederation, the first woman to hold that role, by the way. She's been in New Zealand this week, a second visit in a few months following her attendance at Helen Kelly's funeral in October. Sharan Burrow says as New Zealand takes more and more short-term migrant workers, temporary, not unionised, beyond the usual kinds of safety nets you might get if you're a permanent staff member or living in New Zealand full-time, it's essential to protect them against risk and exploitation. Last week, the CTU called for the government to legislate to ensure people employed by overseas companies get at least minimum New Zealand pay and conditions while they're working here. Migrant workers and their vulnerability are increasingly under the spotlight as events like the Football World Cup in Qatar expose the treatment of migrant workers in that country. And Sharan Burrow says countries like New Zealand must lead by example.
There's a global deficit of decent work. We need to rewrite the rules of the global economy. We need, of course, to put proper labour laws under supply chains, but also when it comes to the mobility of people. When we negotiated in Australia and New Zealand, you were actually ahead of us, the seasonal workers scheme, for example, the conditions were good. But as you've got competition from employers that really want to exploit migrant workers, then the best of that scheme becomes undermined. When you add to that the slavery we now find in our fishing industry, or indeed some of our agricultural plantations, or in this country, the huge farms where people are exempt, or the Chinese investment where they're not operating on any labour laws, then what happens is two things. Those people are exploited, that's bad, but you also undermine the confidence of local labour and families and communities in the labour laws of this country, and you start to get social tensions that are unacceptable. We are very, very committed to the rights of migrant workers. New Zealand is a migrant country. We've built our economy, but if there isn't equal treatment, then the benefits of migrant labour that add to the income and the jobs that are associated with that of domestic workers here, of national workers, Kiwis, those things all become entangled in an anxiety that says this is all too hard. So governments must do more.
How do you disentangle, particularly when labour is attached to capital? So if Chinese capital is building infrastructure in New Zealand, how do you separate a requirement for the labour that they are bringing with them to be immune from, excused from New Zealand labour laws?
Well, you can't, and that's just criminal. You have to have domestic labour laws that companies have to actually respect. So it's a simple recipe. What working families need is the security of social protection, a minimum wage on which they can live with dignity, or minimum living wages, collective bargaining rights, because there's a global slump in the labour income share, which is actually affecting our companies because demand is slumping and we get global stagnation as well. And of course you need the rule of law, compliance, where you can take disputes to the courts or the labour tribunals, pending what systems in what country, and it's respected. So it doesn't matter whether it's Chinese companies or Thai fishing companies, or it's Filipino employers working here exploiting their own people, as I saw yesterday in a terrible case here in New Zealand. The labour laws must be the same, there must be equal treatment, and the compliance must be trusted.
Are governments going to listen to you?
They have to. What you're seeing is people's anxiety now growing throughout the world. And the response is, you can actually say free trade is good for everybody. We would argue with some of that, but no one's opposed to trade. But you will not get people to stand firm and defend our democracies if they're not working for the security of working families. And therefore you get the populist vote. You've got the situation in the US, but you've also got the challenges now in Europe, and people are retreating into a nationalism that's about protection for themselves and their families. It's not the answer, but if you don't put the rules that are the rules of decent work, and again, that simple recipe, social protection, minimum living wages, collective bargaining rights, and the rule of law, if that's not in place, then of course people will fight the system. They'll be anti-establishment because the establishment's not working for them.
Sharan Burrow, who's been in the country this week.